Okay. It seems like folks are quiet right now, but there will be more opportunities to participate, and feel free to introduce yourself at any time. This is the session on building progressive infrastructure beyond elections. And you might be wondering what does this mean, or maybe you know exactly what it means. And the way we decided, uh, hold on, I'm just checking out the chat box. We got a message from our tech support, Nicole. Great, thanks, Nicole. So let's actually go through some logistics and then we'll dig in. Logistics, this session is being recorded. We encourage you to use the chat box to interact with panelists. Let us know when you like something we're saying. Let us know when you have a different thought. If you have a question, please use the question and answer tool. That way we can make sure we get to all the questions. And then drop any tech challenges in the chat box, and the room host, Nicole, will help you out. Cool. My name again is Rosa Spinola. I use they, them pronouns, and I'll introduce myself in a bit. We also have Ejike Obiname from Color of Change. Hi, Ejike. We have Dr. Gabriela Lemus, board member at Netroots Nation, as well as other organizations. We have Jamar Brown from Repower. And Gabby, I think your camera is off right now.
Should I start it?
There you are. And then we have Barb Cardell from Positive Women's Network. I'll be moderating. And the reason this panel idea came up is that we see over and over tons of money being poured into elections. And a lot of the tech tools we use were built for elections rather than being built for advocacy work. A lot of times we're able to scale up infrastructure right when an election is happening, but what happens after the election? And so I wanted to put together some of the most brilliant people I know for this panel to talk about what they're doing right now to make sure that this opportunity isn't wasted. And so I'm gonna let them each introduce themselves, and I would love for them to each to explain as they introduce themselves, what areas of infrastructure does their work focus on? And I'll hand it over to Ejike first.
Thank you so much for that, Rose. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Ejike Obineme, pronouns he, him. Currently, I serve as the National Data and Analytics Director at Color of Change. And when I think about progressive infrastructure, I think about how to create sustainable systems by which people can meet their own goals that doesn't reinforce the same violences that we are purportedly against. And so career speaking, as a technologist, I'm deeply preoccupied with how we can do this on technical terms and how we can utilize the digital landscape. And I think a lot of times we think about tools when we talk about infrastructure and we think about staffing, but a lot of times I want to help and encourage folks and offer to folks to think about how we can decolonize how we think about technology, not just as an extension of capitalism and a way to make money, but also in terms of how we can create self-managed systems and how we can create a shared space and democratize our power. And so I think a lot of times we think about tools, and that kind of leads to this type of tool fetishism. But we also, before we engage in a practice about how we create progressive infrastructure, we have to think about how we are internalizing these systems, right? And sometimes internalizing these systems means that rejecting how we internalize these systems means moving past funder interests and thinking about the long term and rejecting the type of transactional nature that comes with electoral campaigns and such. And so one of the things that I want to lift up before I pass it on is thinking about technical protagonism and thinking about how do we think about ourselves, how do we center ourselves in these fights when we think about building long-lasting infrastructure. A lot of times our first inclination when it comes to building infrastructure is to look for help elsewhere and to look for a vendor or look for other groups that have some sort of expertise, but a lot of times we have that expertise within our own communities. And so I think a lot about technical protagonism. And in terms of the work that I do, what's really great is that Color Change really thinks about the digital space as a particular focus in how we intervene for our organizing, voter contact, and other objective ends. And I think when we think about technical protagonism, it's not just about building tools, although that is important. We have to think about our collective bargaining power and how we stand in opposition to this type of monopolization that a lot of vendors are having right now. How do we create ownership and our own protagonism in this space?
Thank you, Ejike. I'm going to pass it over to Barb.
Great, thank you, Rose. So I'm Barb Cardell, and I'm with the U.S. Positive Women's Network. And our mission, and it's really kind of important when we talk about infrastructure, because we come at it from a different perspective. You know, our mission is to prepare and involve women living with HIV and people of trans experience in all levels of policymaking and decision making. And so we're talking about taking a body of people who have, from the early days of the HIV movement, really sought to be involved in any decision that is going to impact our lives, knowing full well that if we waited for our government to come and prepare anything for us, that it was going to, first off, probably not fulfill our needs, and certainly was not going to be as effective as something we created from the ground up. So we come at infrastructure and at progressive infrastructure in particular to think about the tools that are out there, who we can partner with, and certainly how we can make change that is sustainable, that is led by advocates, by the people who are most impacted. And so I think it's, you know, so important, because when we're talking about, you know, really looking at who is going to most be able to use these tools, there are a lot of technology barriers, but once we're able to start coming from the grassroots level and moving up, we are able to take what has been engagement and move it beyond just this election to really integrated voter engagement, because we know that if we are able to mobilize it in a way that's powerful and use infrastructure that currently exists and maybe adapt it so that it answers the needs of our community, that it can move beyond the election and can actually implement change in people's lives in a broader sense. And that has been what the HIV movement has done since the beginning, since the early 80s, is to say, what do we need? How do we figure out how to make it happen? And how do we really work at supporting both ourselves as well as others who are partners in the struggle?
Thank you, Barb. And Jamar from Repower.
Wonderful. Hi, Rose. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for inviting me, and obviously to all of the panelists. And my name is Jamar Brown. I am based in Texas, but I work for an organization called Repower. And Repower is a national training organization that trains organizations and practitioners across the progressive movement to really gearing toward building power, but also more importantly, building the skills and the capacity of folks that are involved in this important work. And so we work with organizations that run the gamut on issues such as voting rights, fair courts, you know, workers' rights, women's rights, you name it, we do that work. And one of the things I think that's most important in terms of the work that we're doing is really how do we take what most folks would know as training, right? That they come to a Netroots conference or they go to any other conference. Now that we're all on Zoom, how do we take that and really deepen our capacity for electoral work right now? And so that's been the focus of what we are doing. And obviously, as everyone is aware, that we are dealing with a COVID-19 pandemic. And so we have had to make a shift as an organization, along with organizations in this movement, really gearing toward virtual trainings, but also looking at what does online organizing look like? What does social distance organizing look like? Because we have to really address that there is a pandemic, but that we want folks to turn out in this election, right? We want to run our numbers up in this election. And so that has been the intersection of training, but also skill development that we have been meeting and working across organizations to be able to make sure that we meet. The second thing that's important is really how do we deepen the capacity? And so what we see across campaigns and across organizations this election cycle is new people that are involved, not only in the process, but new people that are involved in leading and building voter contact work. And so part of that work is really thinking of how are we talking to people online, but how are you turning them out because you are able to talk to them online? How are you able to build relational organizing models? Because you're not knocking on someone's door. You're calling them, you're texting them, maybe you're contacting them on social media. And so being able to find that. And then obviously we'll be talking more about the election, but we are also deepening leadership in progressive movement because obviously, as we know, is a movement. It's not, you know, the next 80 days that is the election. It has to go on for years after. And so we want to make sure that we're also deepening that capacity for folks to advocate at legislative session, right? And holding those same elected officials that they just elected accountable when legislative session, for example, comes around. That we're training people to run for office in 2021 and 2022, right? That, you know, leadership is also building out who would be the next cadre of elected officials. And so we have in that mix a lot of work and a lot of strategy that we are thinking about, and looking forward to the rest of the panel and answering any questions that folks that are joining may have around some of that work.
Thanks, Jamar. And Dr. Gabriela Lemus. You're on mute.
You keep moving my technology, girl. Okay. Okay, I had it unmuted. All right, thank you so much, Rose, for pulling this together. It's always rough being the last speaker, right? So I have a lot of thoughts on this because a lot of what I do is big picture thinking and working across organizations across the country in different types of phases of development. So for me, infrastructure, also since I do it as a board member or as a consultant, a lot of what I do is individually, but I come out of the civil rights space and academia. And when I moved into the progressive space, part of what I realized is that, especially because I came out of the Latino civil rights space, I had to define what was progressive. And that's still the case for a lot of people, especially the more and more grassroots we dig down. And I think you have to figure out what it means to you and to the people around you and how it impacts folks on the ground, as you just heard, like, I think it was Jamar that said it. It's really going to vary. So that kind of training that they're doing is critical to be able to really build the infrastructure. Because you're right, the whole purpose of this is we got to go beyond this, this election cycle. The problems that COVID-19 demonstrated, along with the crashing economy, is that a lot of communities are totally being impacted. And what I'm also seeing for the first time in a very long time is that there's deep digital divides. So when you're talking about building infrastructure, in some places you're looking at this more advanced work, and in others it's really baby steps, because we haven't found that transition space between the old school on the ground knocking on doors versus what's happening digitally. So I think that's something we have to think about, that the organizations I've been working with, I'm trying to help them out. So not everybody has a cell phone. As much as we'd like to think they do, they don't. But certain communities are more cell phone dependent than others. So how do you work with that? Like young Latino men versus Latino women who will more likely come on a computer and work out whatever interaction she's having in that infrastructure space. I also think that as we think about this infrastructure building, we have to think about the interaction, again, two liminal spaces. Top down, yeah, sure, we know that's going to happen. That's where the policy space is, but also bottom up. What do we want? And I love this idea. I think it was, I'm going to mispronounce your name.
Educate.
Like
education.
Yeah. Educate. And he's talking about this idea of interacting, individually. Sorry, I'm just losing my train of thought here. And that bottom-up building is critical, But again, we have to think through the transitions between generations and also folks who haven't had access to voting in the first place. So part of what I've been doing is building out a number of series related to everything. I started in late May on voter engagement during COVID as part of that cycle rebuilding, because frankly, what we're seeing is a lot of people don't know what's going on. We did a voter protection session, for example, as part of the infrastructure, because part of the infrastructure is also teaching people about the issues and how they interconnect, so that when you do reach out to them with this developed training and infrastructure, they can relate back to you so that they feel the need. You know, it always goes back to community, right? And so we're building digital communities, but we're also, where do we live? What are our everyday issues? So we have to figure out ways to connect the two. I'll leave it there. I can talk about policy forever. So thank you.
Thank you, Gabi. And so I want to talk about how the folks on this panel first got involved in organizing. And given your unique path, the feelings that come up for you with elections and what the opportunities are with each election and what the challenges are. And so speaking for myself, I first got started organizing 12 years ago in a majority women, majority people of color collective, and we forced our university to publicly divest $15 million from a hotel company with labor rights violations. And 9 schools followed, and workers won a union. And I thought it was totally normal to be part of a majority people of color, majority women collective and be 20 years old and to win that and then keep winning things like that. But about 6 years into organizing, I was like, wait a minute, what if we actually followed up with every single person who supports us? And I know for us, it was like, we didn't really know how to use the database. We weren't phone banking through our supporters. And so I went to work for the Florida Democratic Party. And I learned all about analytics, how to make maps, how to build analytics reports, and with the commitment that I was actually going to bring that back to the advocacy space. And so for me, this moment, one of the opportunities it presents is an opportunity to skill up our folks in some of the areas, in some of the strong areas of electoral campaigns, like data and analytics, and then be able to apply those to advocacy campaigns to win things like Medicare for All, or to win things like defunding the police. And so I'm going to pass it over to Ejike to talk about how did you get involved in organizing, and like what perspective does that give you on both the challenges and opportunities of an election?
Wow, that's a great question. A lot of times when people ask me those type of questions, my first response is I have no idea how I got here, but I got here somehow. I think,
actually know your story though.
This is true. I think that in some ways my political awakening came in the Gina 6 moment in Louisiana, when some kids were charged with attempted murder. And when I got to that city, I was brought into a tradition of organizing and a space that I had not been aware of. And lucky for me, I had some really powerful, brilliant Black women elders that took me under their wing and took this kind of rambunctious young man who was still trying to figure things out and brought me into a community that was involved in deep study, looking at the issues that we face, and also, involved in community building. Audre Lorde says, without community, there is no liberation. And so one of the things that I became preoccupied with is how do we create these networks and these linkages, not just in specific marginalized groups, but across marginalized groups, and how do we create a force for good. And then I would say that once upon a time at a nonprofit, I fixed the printer, and then I was the tech guy. and the tech led to data reports and coding and programming and software engineering, etc. years ago, and it led me to electoral campaign work. One of the things I was certainly focused on, and I think a lot of people that get engaged in technology and data analysis get pulled into that because so much money comes into that space. And I think one of the pitfalls of that, obviously, is this type of transactionalism that takes place, right? And the transactionalism is something that takes place that even shows up in the very design of the programs that we use, from the methodologies that we think about when we're doing voter contact. And if you do not have an anti-racist, feminist perspective when you're creating these systems, you will inevitably perpetuate those systems.
That's right.
And so one of the things that I've had to realize is that from the very beginning, we have to challenge how people are thinking about creating these technologies and how they are deployed. And that obviously goes back to, I'm preoccupied obviously with technology as a technologist, but that goes back to the technical capacity thing. And one of the things also that's important, I think, is challenging these mythologies around what bodies and what communities possess technical capacity. In some ways, we kind of reinforce these type of negative ideas, and we kind of picture, if I tell everybody to close their eyes and say, what does a computer programmer look like? Sometimes, you have a particular idea, and that person typically doesn't look like me. Maybe not as good looking. No, I'm just kidding. But I think we really have to think about the problems that transactionalism creates, and some of the opportunities that we have on the flip side is that we can channel all this money that's coming in and to think about not just creating all these proprietary software that these campaigns build and nobody can use after the fact, but thinking about open sourcing projects and thinking about open sourcing projects, not just in terms of gaining access for the community, but also in having people contribute. Because a lot of times with when you use these vendors, when you use these tools that these vendors create, there's a lot of features that are missing and a lot of problems with these tools that don't meet the immediate needs of the community, and the shape of these tools do not always best serve these communities. And so I'm deeply thinking about how we can use all this campaign money, create these long-lasting open source projects, right, that we can collectively build, right, build up our own internal capacities around, and develop technologies that help serve us. So.
Thanks, Ejike. Shamar, how about you? How did you get involved in organizing, and how does that impact how you see the opportunities and challenges of an election?
Yeah, well, one of the things I think that's important for me, I grew up in South Carolina. And so I grew up in Charleston. So, most people know Charleston for beautiful beaches, maybe good seafood, those of you who have been, and that's great, right? But, I was raised by a grandmother who taught in public schools, who taught in segregated public schools in South Carolina. And in the early 90s, when I was young, she decided to run for school board. And she decided to run for the school board. She had never run for office. She's a teacher. She was involved in teachers union, involved in her community and the Democratic Party and everything. And she basically decided to run because she was sick and tired of being sick and tired. And our campaign was run at the kitchen table, right? It's pick up the phone book, call everybody pass out bulletins everywhere you go, right? We didn't have the van and every action and all the fancy things we all love, at this time. But what it showed me was, we have to build people to be part of the political system and to be part of building policy, to be part of executing effective elections and effective issue campaigns. And so over the past 10 years of my life, I have been working on different things, whether I worked at Planned Parenthood, whether I worked on local, state, and federal campaigns, et cetera. And what I think we see that's unique, at least in my experience of coming into organizing in this particular election is, everything Ejike just said, like, making sure you have anti-racist, things in place and, all of that. But one of the things, we are not only facing a pandemic, we are also facing an uprising. And my grandmother got involved because of the uprising in the 50s and the 60s around fighting against segregated schools. And now my generation, we are seeing this uprising around police brutality. And so we're seeing as specifically Black people, but also people of color, BIPOC folks across the country are now dealing with the same type of uprising, maybe a different issue that started the uprising. And so that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing folks that are now paying attention to district attorney elections, that are paying attention to judicial elections. But at least in Texas, we elect our judges. Some states do, some states have different procedures. We're looking at who's state representative. When we're looking at police funding, we're looking at who's on city council and doing all those things. And so for me, I think what we're seeing is that we're going to have a transition in leadership based on this uprising. And so people who would have never run for office, folks think you have to go to college, right? You have to have this fancy degree and all these fancy titles and all of that to be able to do it. And now folks are really realizing that democracy should be more accessible. The political system and campaigns should be more accessible to anybody who desires to serve and represent in their community. And so we have worked on the gamut on both sides, right, with candidates around how they talk about their message, how they understand in their message that they are the effective person right now for that community, right? And how we're changing who sits in the seats when we're talking about building infrastructure of power, because a lot of the issues that my fellow panelists and folks that are watching work on, we have to change who's in the room, right? And so we're doing a lot of that work right now with candidates. And then there's the other side, right? There's the progressive infrastructure building and the training that we're doing really around how are we working with organizations at looking at how do they engage folks at least online as much as possible. Gabriella mentioned earlier that everyone doesn't have a cell phone. So what's the other way to contact them? Also, we're trying to think through opportunities around being, doing relational organizing. So it's about how do we build an organizing model that is reflective of the people in that respective community, right? That is not just Jamar walking into some precinct and saying everyone needs to go vote. It's about saying, how does Jamar empower Barb to go to her friends and say, this is why I'm voting and this is why you need to vote. And so I think that those are some strategies and things that we're looking at. And so the opportunities we have is that we're changing the face of what leadership looks like in our communities across the country. But now we're changing the face of who's leading the campaigns to influence those new people. And that's something that's really important, as it relates to this work. And so that's what I'm really super excited about in this election, is that going into 2021 and 2022, we're going to have whole new people who are running for office, who are running campaigns, who are running these progressive organizations, right? That, more BIPOC people, more women of color, et cetera, will be in leadership positions inside the movement, inside key organizations. And then also not just leading organizations that are already established, developing their own organizations, filling gaps that may exist in their states and in their communities. And so we have a lot to look forward to, not only in this election, but even going forward. And so it's interesting that this is full circle for me, that the person who trained me in politics, now I'm training other people in politics around an uprising, right? And trying to make something different. And so that's what I'm excited about, and that's based on my experience.
I love that, Jamar. Thank you. And Barb, I think really does bring a unique perspective to this, in that I find that in my movement work, there's often not attention to disability rights and to accessibility. And working with Barb over the past year brought me to a place where I was finally able to think of myself as someone who deals with chronic health problems without shame. And so thank you, Barb, and I would love to hear more about how you got involved in organizing and how that impacts your take on elections and the challenges and opportunities.
Yeah, thank you, Rose, and thank you for those your kind words. And I think that we inspire each other and lift each other up in so many ways. So I appreciate that. So I came to organizing, the organizing work in college. I went to Grinnell College, where we we're back protesting the anti-apartheid movement, and ever based on that, I started looking around and thinking a lot about how I wanted to move through the world. And I changed my major to be in political science, because I wanted to maybe not run for office, but I certainly wanted to be, to use the Hamilton quote, in the room where it happened, because I felt that so many of the times perspectives of people were left out, and that we have this rarefied vision of power and influence. And I wanted to try and break that down and figure out how we work to bring more people in. And I moved back to Colorado after college and started working on political campaigns for candidates that were never ideal, but were as progressive as we felt could get elected. And I always chafed at that, feeling that we were not getting the best of what we needed, that we weren't getting the brightest ideas, that we weren't getting the most progressive values, but it was what could get elected. And that was very, very educational, because it was also, I looked at who was involved in the organizing around the campaigns. And it was the same thing. It was people who were, very educated, who had time to be able to go out and mobilize. Then I tested HIV positive, and that was 30 years ago. And I'm very open about my status, and I'm open about the impact that it has had on my life and how it has shifted a lot of the values and the things that I thought were going to happen, primarily because there's so much stigma around women living with HIV and people living with HIV. And that is part of what I refuse to buy into. I very proudly say that the work that I have done has been mobilized and radicalized by living and working with women who are living with HIV and people who are living with HIV, who have been told for so many years that their opinions don't matter and that they should just sit down and accept whatever they have. So it was very interesting, because I realized that we do this community mobilization in HIV work and disability work that requires us to take to the streets and to protest and to shut things down and to try and get our voices heard. And we amassed a number of people to try and move that forward. And I've really been, since I came to PWN, thinking that we need to connect those two pieces. We need to connect that mobilization of grassroots and numbers and people to protest with the power that comes from elections and being in the rooms where power is often built, or decisions and policies are decided. And so I have been very excited. We've been mobilizing in the 2018 election and then also in 2020 for PWN to say, what if we were to take these communities that are often assumed are not going to vote, are not registered to vote, are not interested in voting, and what if we started at the grassroots? And Rose, we had this incredible boot camp that was a week-long training for 45 women living with HIV, predominantly women of color from across the United States, where we brought them together and we said, let's start talking about soup to nuts, how do we mobilize people, and what does electoral organizing look like, and what does integrated voter engagement look like? So after the election, we continue to use this power that we built, this base that we mobilize. And it's been remarkable, because we've gone from, women where we were originally saying, are you registered to vote? Oh, voting is important. To now they're holding candidate forums where they are asking some tough questions. Some of them are creating voter guides, and they're saying, I'm not going to endorse a candidate if I can't pick up a phone and they don't call me back. That amount of power for people who are so often disenfranchised is incredible. And that's what we really are working on, is to be able to take that. And as you can see, as I start getting very excited, I talk with my hands, but to be able to bring that meaningful engagement and to share that knowledge and that level of engagement with our people, and also to move it beyond just our community. Because we know, and I'll finish up on this last thought, that there's 1.2 billion people in the United States who are living with HIV. And we talk about that as being our core group that we're going to mobilize, because we know that they can then go and influence millions of other people as well. And that comes from people who have often not been engaged and now are really starting to seize their power and see how important that is. And trust me, this is not going to stop after the election. It's going to continue because we have a really energized base that has so much, really so much that they are engaged in doing.
Thank you, Barb. And Gabby.
So I guess I started probably in the late 90s to become an organizer. I was an academic. I was a professor at the University of Memphis. And we had a very large community of Latino immigrants who arrived not from across the border. They had already been in the United States. They were arriving in the South because there was a big boom, right? Economic boom. So there was a lot of construction going on. And we had workers coming in from LA and Chicago primarily. But we also had a wave of crime. And I sat on the crime commission for Memphis Shelby County area, and nobody was doing anything. People were getting jumped. They were getting a lot of home robberies. I ended up becoming a volunteer for just about everything. Everything from young men being shot and talking to them and translating at hospitals to sending young men home to Mexico in caskets. And I worked with federal law enforcement, et cetera. But what I realized that was really important was that the community was not integrating itself into the larger community. So I worked with the Black churches, actually, and those Black women, they taught me. And we started organizing bit by bit. And I also sat on the Memphis Shelby County and the Tri-State AIDS Commission. I was representing the Latino community. I ended up doing all these things because there was no representation. So that then said, if I leave this town, what am I leaving behind me? So I started in community, doing just basic community organizing. And you know, people take off on their own. Then I came to DC and I started running large programs across states. And a lot of things, you know, the one thing I know is that organizing is local. You can organize nationally, and this is where I think of our progressive community, especially in the digital space. We're a community, and we are interacting with one like we're doing right now. For us, this is normal, but we do the same thing on the ground. And when we're working on these issues, you know, whether it's you know, environmental justice or this horrible policing situation that's just, it seems to be exploding, but the sad part is that we're seeing it because of technology. And we have a pandemic that has pushed a lot of people out, and you start to see the barriers and the lack of access in the African American and the Latino and certain immigrant communities, and people getting sick and dying. And this is why the infrastructure has to continue being built. The election is just one thing. The reality is what the explosions are about is these pressures that we've been feeling that have been aggravated because of the current political structure, which is also harmful. So I love this idea of democratizing technology. I think that's phenomenal, and I'm all for it. I know, however, technology is expensive. So how are we going to start bridging these, you know, these gaps? And I think for the future, and, you know, I started off by saying, how do you define progressive? I think it does depend by community, but I think there's certain precepts that cross all communities, and it's fairness, it's justice, and democracy, and a democratic system that works for all, right? And the only way to do that, to repeat what some of you have already said, is we have to be at the table, not just when the decisions are being made, but when the questions are being asked. And one thing I love about technology is it facilitates that. And if you have access to it, it's, you know, it's easier to get through in some ways. And then the question is, what actions are going to be taken? And, you know, we'll be in this fight for a long time, fellas. So I'm glad we met.
Thank you. Attendees, folks watching this at home, I would love for you to ask questions, share your thoughts. You can put them in the chat box or in the Q&A. And I'm going to pause for about 30 seconds. And if we have some questions come through, we'll ask those. Otherwise, I have a couple other questions.
From my Rose.
You all are really quiet. Okay, so I want to do a quick round, quicker than the previous rounds. And I want to invite each of you to answer. One, what is one ask that you have for folks in the audience in order to support your work? Because and thank you for giving your time to be on this panel today. And then my second question for you is, what is one thing they can do to seize this moment where we have a ton of resources flowing into our organizations in order to prepare for post-election? So what is one ask you have for them? And then what is one thing they can do within their own organizations? And I'm gonna hand it over to Jamar first.
Sure. So one of the things about Repower, and for those of you who follow us, is we just launched a new national campaign called We Will Not Be Muted. And we really want to highlight and uplift the stories of people who are doing meaningful work across the country, right? Whether you're working on voting rights or reproductive rights or civil rights or police brutality or immigration reform or environmental justice, I mean, whatever issue brings you to the progressive work, we want you to join that campaign and really share your story so that we can build story bank together of how we're talking about that, not only in this election, but in our communities, why we will not be muted, right? And so for me, I do this training work is to make sure that people have the skills so that as Gabrielle, excuse me, said,
It's all good.
as Gabriella said, right, it's not just who's in the room, but who's asking the questions, and how can we use this time to really make sure we empower people. We are launching right after Labor Day a 8-week training series. There are 2 parts. There's a one-on-one, there's an intro to digital organizing for those of you who are looking at opportunities if you have the accessibility. And then the second part is a 201 that will be in October that's focused on women of color and leadership in campaigns. And so that will be at advanced training. And so visit our site here that Rose just put in the chat for everyone to look into those trainings and to look into how to apply to those trainings. We will be doing 8 weeks of training this fall. I know that folks are busy, but we want to make sure we're providing some skills support as well in that work. The second part to the question around what can you be doing in your organizations is, I think one part of it is managing your sphere of influence. We all have some type of influence, whether you are a director or an executive director or a manager. You know, I'm not sure everyone's exact role that is watching this, but I want to go back to what we talked about earlier, is making sure that we're talking about the accessibility issues and that we are not making assumptions in organizations that people have access to technology or that people have access to money, because every organization doesn't get the big fund, right? And so I think one of the things you can challenge is that when assumptions are being made about a group of people or a community of people, really calling that out and really challenging that so that your organization or your campaigns, et cetera, are not overlooking the very people you may be trying to help or that you say that you're trying to help. And so I think that that is something that's really important. We make a lot of assumptions in this movement because we just, like Gabriella said, right, we live this, right, and we breathe this, but the average person, if you walk into the mall or you walk down the street, they don't breathe it the way we do. And so how are we building the system and how are we building our organizations in a way that's not just accessible, but also relatable to people that we want to help? So those are my 2 responses.
Thank you, Jamar. And Gabby.
Well, I have a lot of things I'd like people to help me with, but I think you know what, one thing that's become very clear, and maybe because it's at the front of my mind, is voter protection. I want everybody to educate themselves about the voting, that is what the rules are in their state, how parties who are in charge are ensuring that people are able to vote, and you know, beyond just this, you know, vote by mail because of fear of COVID, I think we also have to think about what's going to be on the ground and what is the technology. One of the things we're learning in state after state is that there's a lot of high level technology. So I'm going to assume most of you are fairly young. I encourage you to be poll workers, because most poll workers are retirees and they are in that danger zone. And it's not just because of COVID though, it's also because you are facile with technology, and the technology changes have been very abrupt. They've been very last minute. We saw it in Georgia, we've seen it in South Carolina, North Carolina, and it varies county by county. So it's a different of approach towards it, right? As they try to build their infrastructure for the election system, you are the experts. So we need you there.
Thank you, Gabby. And Barb, what is one ask you have for folks to support your work? And then what is one thing you encourage their organizations to do?
Yeah, so we are asking everyone to pledge to be a healthcare voter, and to have that be something in particular that they are looking at when they are thinking about candidates. And I put a link to our site in the chat box, and you can go ahead and sign up to be a healthcare voter there. So that's my ask. And the one thing people can do is to request an absentee ballot if you're not in a vote by mail state. What we are planning on, at least in the groups that I'm talking to, is that this election is going to need all of us to be able to do everything that we can as the election approaches, to be able to make sure that everyone can vote. And so having your vote taken care of ahead of time will be a good way that you can then mobilize to help support everyone else in accessing their voting rights as well.
Thank you. And Educate, what's one ask you have to support your work? And then one thing that other organizations can be doing to prepare for post-election?
Yeah. So I just posted in the chat, shameless plug. votingwhileblack.com/volunteer. Come participate in our PAC and our work. One of the great things about our PAC is that we're not just, our goal structure isn't just concerned about how many people we contact, but also how many people we mobilize. And so when we think about how do we build infrastructure beyond elections, it's about bringing people into the fold and making them the leaders in their own communities. I think somebody said something about, it was once said, we need a leaderful movement, not a movement with just a couple charismatic leaders. And so I think I would encourage folks to get involved. I think we're trying to create some distributed systems by which you can participate in your pajamas, on your couch, on a Zoom call, join a textathon, make some phone calls, even have one-on-ones with folks to really get involved in this process, despite the pandemic that we're in. In terms of the asks that I would have for folks and organizations in this moment, I really think that, to kind of go back a little bit to what I've been saying before, I think folks should really see themselves as the technical champions that they're looking for. A lot of times, the folks that come up in this space and gain technical capacity don't have computer science degrees. They're like a Canvas manager that has, a lot of spreadsheets open, and they're like monitoring all of the Canvas work and the volunteers, and they have all these fancy Excel formulas that they've taught themselves, and COUNTIFs, and if anybody knows about Excel, the COUNTIFs and the VLOOKUPs and all this stuff, that's coding. And so a lot of times when you see that, one of the things I would encourage people is to be able to locate that and encourage and cultivate that and say, you've been coding in these Excel sheets. Let's see how we can make you a technical champion. And so that you can gain some capacity and you can also participate and grow in the space, send them to Repower to get trained and to build up their skills. And really commit to this so that we can really kind of shift this kind of like technical saviorism that happens, where we have these outside people who are not in our communities coming in to places where there's a vacuum of technical capacity and knowledge and experience, and they come in and they make all the decisions, and then they create some dependency models by which we pay a whole lot of money, they do some stuff, and then now we're dependent on them, and the CEO has got a private jet. And that's no hyperbole. With these vendors, they've been able to monopolize in a certain way where they've been able to accumulate a lot of capital. And so I think with doing that, when we can build our own capacities, instead of buying, charging people and getting private jets, we can think about how we can create a sustainable movement, right? And we can build our own tools and fund our own movement, and also think about how we can increase access, right? Part of democratizing technology, I love what Gabriella was saying, is thinking about access. And so we have to think critically about how we can deploy these systems. We can gain this technological expertise and deploy these systems in a way that's radically affordable and equitable, and not fall into the type of kind of tool fetishism that a lot of folks kind of fall in. One quote, and I'll leave it at this, I think that was really stuck with me, which is that the danger is not that computers start to think like humans, but that humans start to think like computers. And I think that we're not going to engineer our way out of everything, right? And so we have to think about, technologically speaking, where should we be strategic in technology and where we should not be deploying technology, right? And not mediate our organizing efforts through that. And so I think that's important. I would ask folks to see themselves as the leaders in their own spaces.
Thank you, Educate. Thank you, Barb. Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Jamar. I'm going to go ahead and put up our panelists' contact info as well as my own. And we'll stick around for 5 more minutes in case you have any questions, thoughts. We would love to engage. And thanks, Alyssa. I see your comment in the chat box. Thank you, everyone. Also, panelists, if you want to talk amongst yourselves right now, feel free. Just remember that this is being recorded.
Always. There you are. Thank you, guys. I learned a lot.
Thanks, Udis.
Thank you. I knew Rose was going to put together an incredible panel.
Of course, right? What else? Good questions, too.
Yeah, very thought-provoking.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Our host says that they will be ending the session in a few moments, and we can continue conversations in the virtual hallways. Thank you, host Nicole.
Okay. Thank you.
Nicole, I think it's okay if you go ahead and end us now.
Very quiet.
Thank